To the United States now, where we're tracking the impasse that's led to a partial government shutdown. The Senate is voting again on the short-term budget. Republicans and Democrats have not agreed on several issues. The most notable is a deal on immigration to protect the country's so-called dreamers. The parties have been blaming each other for the impasse. The shutdown began on Saturday morning. However, its impact has only started to be felt on Monday, with non-essential federal employees staying home from work. Well, with each day the partial government shutdown continues in the United States, the impact grows on state services. CGTN's Toby Muse has more.
Both Republicans and Democrats spent Sunday blaming each other for the U.S. federal shutdown. Republicans accused Democrats of attempting to mar President Donald Trump's one-year anniversary in office by not funding the government.
The Democratic leader made the political calculation to do something that, according to a recent survey, even most Democrats don't support. He shut down the government to appease a portion of his party's left-wing base.
Democrats say it was Trump's refusal to agree to a deal on immigration to provide citizenship to minors who entered the U.S. illegally years ago. At the moment, the Democrats say there must be an agreement on these immigrants, often referred to as the Dreamers, in order to get funding restored.
The president must take yes for an answer. Until he does, it's the Trump shutdown. He has said he has a love for Dreamers, let him show it. He said he needs a wall and border security. Accept our offer to do both of those things.
The shutdown began at 12:01 Saturday morning, so it's only been a weekend with minimal impact. That all changes Monday morning, when tens of thousands of non-essential federal employees will be told to stay home if there's no solution. The last government shutdown occurred when Barack Obama was president back in 2013. The Republicans took most of the blame. They hope that since they now control the White House as well as the House and Senate, opposition by the Democrats will be viewed as the reason. Public opinion will be crucial. If it hardens and one side gets the blame, we may see that party desperate to end the standoff and get funding restored. Toby Muse, CGTN, Washington.
We are getting you live pictures as the U.S. Senate votes once more on the short-term budget and the disagreements that have led to the partial government shutdown. Let's listen in.
Both Democrats and Republicans voted against that bill. The reason the Republican majority had such difficulty finding consensus is they could never get a firm grip on what the president of their party wanted to do. These days, you never know who to deal with when it comes to the Republicans. The Republican leaders told me to work out a deal with the White House. The White House said work it out with Republican leaders on the Hill. Separately, President Trump turned away from not one, but two bipartisan compromises. Each would have averted this shutdown. Each would have led to a deal on the budget and health care and disaster aid, and things like opioids and veterans and pensions, and on immigration. My recent offer to the president was a generous one. I put his signature campaign issue on the table in exchange for DACA, and still, he turned away. President Trump's unwillingness to compromise caused the Trump shutdown and brought us to this moment. The facts are well known. Now I wish to update the Senate on where things stand after this weekend. Since our meeting in the Oval Office on Friday, the President and I have not spoken, and the White House refused to engage in negotiations over the weekend. The great deal-making President sat on the sidelines. Despite and because of this frustration, I've been having conversations with the Republican leader over the weekend about a path forward. After several discussions, offers, counteroffers, the Republican leader and I have come to an arrangement. We will vote today to reopen the government, to continue negotiating a global agreement, with the commitment that, if an agreement isn't reached by February the 8th, the Senate will immediately proceed to consideration of legislation dealing with DACA. The process will be neutral and fair to all sides. We expect that a bipartisan bill on DACA will receive fair consideration and an up or down vote on the floor. Now, it's a shame, Mr. President, that the American people and the Senate have had to endure such hand-wringing, finger-pointing stridency to secure a guarantee that we will finally move to address this urgent issue. It is something the majority could have avoided entirely, a concern the President could have obviated if he were only willing to take yes for an answer. While this procedure will not satisfy everyone on both sides, it's a way forward. I'm confident that we can get the 60 votes in the Senate for a DACA bill. And now there is a real pathway to get a bill on the floor and through the Senate. It is a good solution, and I will vote for it. I'm incredibly grateful to the bipartisan group that has come together in recent days to renew the immigration debate with a sense of urgency. There you are. I believe that this group has the potential to return the Senate to the kind of place it should be on the issue of immigration, a place for bipartisanship, a place for action, a place for achievement. The bipartisan group, in a very fine way, filled the glaring absence of the President in these talks. I expect the Majority Leader to fulfill his commitment to the Senate, to me and to the bipartisan group, and abide by this agreement. If he does not, of course, and I expect he will have breached the trust of not only the Democratic senators, but members of his own party as well. Through these complicated and lengthy negotiations, Democrats have always sought to be reasonable, to act in good faith, and get something real done. Despite all of our entreaties, the President was obstinate. Despite bipartisan support for DACA, the Republican majority dithered. The Senate has muddled along for too long, content to delay action on our most pressing challenges until the very last moment. That ends today.
The U.S. Senate there on the short-term budget. And let's now bring in CGTN's Nathan King, live in Washington, D.C. for more on that. Nathan, so what's the significance of those developments now that the Senate is voting?
Well, it's very significant indeed. After 2.5 days of a government shutdown, thankfully, over the weekend, what we're seeing now is essentially a compromise. The lights will be back on at the U.S. government, if not today, then tomorrow morning, if the vote goes according to plan. What's essentially happened is that the Senate have agreed that they will hold a vote or some sort of legislation over the next 2 weeks, but if not, immediately bring it to the floor on one of the Democrats' key priorities. You've heard about these dreamers, these kids that were brought here as illegal immigrants when they were children through no fault of their own. There is a move to give them some sort of status or path to citizenship. That has divided Washington over the last few months, and a vote has not been coming because the Republicans control Congress. The Democrats wanted one. It looks like they're going to get a vote, but not everything they wanted. So an old-fashioned compromise. It's good news, not just for the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, but also here at the White House, a year into Donald Trump's presidency, and the government was shut down to the day. What's been very interesting, I think we heard it from Chuck Schumer here, the biggest Democrat in the Senate, was that this president has not been part of the negotiations. He hasn't spoken to him over the weekend. The great deal maker, he called him, wasn't part of the deal. That has been something that's very, very significant because we have not seen US President Donald Trump weigh in over the last couple of days. Thankfully, say some lawmakers, because his promise to sign a bill, then not to sign a bill, and changing his mind, and the White House debating almost openly in the press about what it should do, confused a lot of lawmakers, not just Democrats, but of their same party, the Republicans. And also, let's face it, it's not just a national embarrassment, sending hundreds of thousands of workers home in the biggest economy in the world, the biggest Western democracy. It's also not good for the US's international image either. It's meant to be a perfect system of government, which it talks about around the world, a shining beacon of a hill, but not so shining when the lights aren't on in federal government offices.
Well, Nathan, it's been a weekend impasse there, and of course the rest of us following across the globe here, we're just wondering how concerned are Americans over the shutdown, and just how concerned should we all be? What are the consequences of it?
Well, if the US government can't agree to fund itself, remember, this is not about a big budget. This is a continuing resolution to keep the lights on just for a few weeks until February 8th, because they can't even agree on a budget. These are stopgap measures. If the US government can't do even that, pay its own bills to its own workers, then how can it start considering all the different trade legislation? How can it consider foreign policy? That sort of thing. A lot of these workers won't be at work today. Thankfully, it's going to reopen tomorrow. But this has happened before in 2013. This could happen again in February if they don't agree on some sort of immigration and border security fix. It's not a good message for the functioning of the US within the United States itself, but also abroad as well. If Donald Trump can't corral his own Congress, how can he corral other nations into getting what the US wants? So it's a very, very negative signal to send out, and people in the US are fed up with the US Congress and the White House. Donald Trump is the most unpopular president in his first year in modern history, around about 36 to 39%. But compare that to the US Congress, that's actually good. They're down around 10, 11, 12, 13%. No one has trust in the political system at the moment, and the infighting within the system just makes it worse.
Well, as you mentioned earlier on, that if the vote goes to plan, then the voting will be to reopen government there. But just going back to that impasse over the weekend, what are the main issues here that's been pushing this?
Right. Well, there are several issues here. First of all, immigration. Now, as you know, the US president campaigned and got elected on building a wall that Mexico was going to pay for. Well, Mexico isn't going to pay for it anymore. So they're trying to get the wall legislation through with about $20 billion, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less. Now, Democrats didn't want that unless they got some sort of deal on these dreamers that we're talking about 800,000 people who came here illegally with their parents when they were children through no fault of their own. They now work here. Some are teachers, policemen, whatever, and no one wants to see 800,000 people deported back to countries they have really never lived in. So there was some sort of deal on the table to give Donald Trump maybe his wall or part of the wall funding in return for giving these dreamers, these 800,000 immigrants, some sort of legal status. There was also a child health care program that was popular on both sides, which is now going to be part of this deal. So they thought there was going to be a trade-off. But the problem was that Donald Trump, the president, first agreed to a deal on the dreamers and the wall, then backed off. There was lots of discussion from the White House, then they backed off. The Republicans couldn't agree amongst themselves in the Senate or the House, even though they're the majority party. And the Democrats basically said, look, let's shut down the government. We have the votes because you need 60 in the Senate to keep funding the government. They had enough votes to shut it down until there's some sort of fix. We haven't fixed this yet. What we've got is a promise that it may be fixed in the next 2 weeks. That's the best they could do after arguing all weekend. It's not a great day for American democracy, I can tell you.
All right, Nathan King, following all the developments of the U.S. government shutdown there from Washington, D.C. And we can now return to those live pictures and the Senate vote. Let's listen in.
It will be a level playing field. It will be open to both sides. We will move to the issue, as you characterized it this morning, of DACA and immigration. Thank you for doing that. I believe that sets the stage for us to work together. For the first time in 5 years, we will have a debate on the floor of the Senate on the DREAM Act and immigration. To all the dreamers who are watching today, don't give up. I know that your lives are hanging in the balance on what we do here on Capitol Hill and with the White House. 3 weeks from now, I hope to be joining you in celebrating the passage with you and your families and your communities of a measure which will strengthen America and give you an opportunity to be part of our future. Mr. President, I yield.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Collins.
The U.S. Senate voting there on the government shutdown and those disagreements that have spiraled over the weekend, now leading to another vote. The government has come to some sort of agreement, but we will wait and see what that vote leads to.